In the cloistered silence of a convent, a single cry shattered centuries of faith. A young nun, pale and trembling, confessed before her sisters that the devil himself had visited her bed. She swore the darkness entered her, leaving behind a seed, not of God, but of hell. The priest scoffed at first. Demonic lust? Satan's child? Such claims had been whispered before, but then her belly swelled. Her body carried proof none could deny. When the child came into the world, witnesses gasped. The infant's feet bore not the softness of flesh, but hooves, split, dark, unmistakable. The Inquisition recorded every detail, calling it a victory of hell over the sanctity of Christ. The mother wept, claiming she was blameless, only a vessel chosen by forces greater than herself. Was she a liar? A victim? Or had the devil truly walked through locked convent doors? The baby's hooves stamped one question into history. What happens when faith fears it is lost? The nun's name was whispered only in fragments across records, as if the church itself feared her memory. She was young, bound by vows of chastity, silence, and obedience, yet suddenly transformed into a symbol of corruption. The Inquisition seized on her case immediately. For them, this was not just scandal, it was proof that Satan could infiltrate even the holiest walls. Her testimony was written in ink, so dark it reads like confession mixed with nightmare. She claimed the devil appeared in visions, his promises dripping with temptation. He did not come as a horned beast, but cloaked in illusions, sometimes as a radiant angel, sometimes as a man of flesh and desire. She told her sisters that resistance was impossible, that her body was shackled by something no prayer could loosen. When her belly began to swell, suspicion became certainty. Midwives brought in by the Inquisition swore the pregnancy advanced too fast, unnaturally accelerated. Whispers spread, this was not human life growing, but an unholy imitation. The convent became a cage of dread, every eye turning against her, half pitying, half terrified. The church ordered her isolation. Her meals were monitored, her prayers watched, her tears recorded like evidence. She was no longer a woman. She was a battlefield. By the time labor arrived, the Inquisition had already prepared the chamber. Witnesses gathered, not to aid her, but to testify. Torches burned, parchments ready, quills sharpened to catch every gasp. And when the child slipped into the world, the air turned to silence. No one spoke, no one dared. The infant's hooves clattered against stone, echoing like a death knell. A midwife fainted. A priest dropped his cross, and the Inquisition declared the matter settled. This was not merely birth, it was hell's victory. Yet in that very moment of shock, one detail haunted those present. The baby cried, not in growls or monstrous screeches, but in the fragile wail of any newborn, human and not human, innocent and condemned. A paradox no scripture had prepared them to answer. The nun, exhausted and broken, begged them not to take her child. But to the Inquisition, this was no child. This was evidence, a living document of sin. They baptized the infant not to save, but to market. A soul already owned by hell, now cataloged by the church. The mother was dragged into endless interrogations, her voice trembling as she repeated her claim, "I did not choose him. The devil chose me." The irony, of course, was bitter. A woman who had devoted herself to God now stood accused as his betrayer. The question that unsettled even the strongest priests was not whether she was guilty, but whether they themselves, in their piety, were safe from the same fate. If the devil could slip past convent walls, what defense did anyone truly have? The Inquisition's methods were merciless. They pressed her with questions designed not for truth, but for confession. Did she invite the devil? Did she bargain with him? Did she find pleasure in the act? Every denial was twisted into guilt, every hesitation branded as proof. Rumors of torture surround these sessions. Whispers that her frail body was bound to racks, her flesh tested with flame, her mind broken until truth and invention blurred. Records are sparse, but the silences in the documents speak as loud as screams. Outside the convent, the story spread like wildfire. Villagers whispered of the devil's child born among holy walls. Fear turned quickly into fervor. Preachers used her case as a sermon, warning that even nuns were not safe, that the devil prowled ceaselessly, waiting for cracks in faith. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers drove their families into confessionals. The church had not just uncovered a scandal, it had found a weapon. Behind closed doors, however, a more dangerous question circulated among scholars. Was this proof of Satan's power or a test of God? Some argued the devil had been granted too much strength, that such a victory over a consecrated nun suggested humanity itself was abandoned. Others insisted it was a trial meant to steel the church's resolve, to remind believers that faith only mattered when it resisted the impossible. The debates were furious. but none dared speak them too loudly. Heresy had a price as final as fire, and through it all, the nun remained trapped between terror and theology. To her, it was not doctrine, not philosophy. It was her body, her suffering, her child torn from her arms. Each day, she repeated the same broken refrain. He came to me. I did not seek him. But to the Inquisition, repetition was weakness, and weakness was guilt. Her story was no longer hers. It belonged to the Church, to the Inquisition, to the fear of every believer who saw her as a living warning. Her face vanished into records, her name buried in fragments. But her child, his hooves, remained etched into the memory of Europe's darkest hours. For in those small, unholy feet lay the greatest question of all. What if faith itself could be defeated by what it feared most? The Inquisition wasted no time turning the nun's tragedy into theater. They staged her hearings as public warnings, dragging her into halls filled with priests, scribes, and witnesses. Shackled, pale, and trembling, she was made to recount the same nightmare over and over. The devil's approach, his touch, the moment she felt her soul chained. Each retelling became less her story and more their weapon. Every word she spoke was twisted into a sermon of fear. The church scribes described the child with obsessive precision. Feet like a goat, cries like a man. They drew sketches, labeling each detail as if cataloging a beast in a bestiary. They held up the hooves as proof of hell's intrusion, parading them before nobles who flocked to witness the abomination. For the masses, it was a spectacle. For the Inquisition, it was power. Fear was the currency, and this nun's body was the mint. But not all agreed. Some whispered doubts. Midwives murmured that deformities could be natural. A few priests argued that the devil's power could not rival God's so directly that the child's hooves may have been a cruel trick of flesh, not a victory of hell. These voices, however, were quickly silenced. To question the narrative was to invite suspicion, and suspicion in the era of the Inquisition meant ruin. The nun herself became a ghost even while alive. She was kept in darkness, fed only enough to keep her breathing, paraded out when needed like a puppet to terrify the crowds. The infant, meanwhile, vanished into secrecy. Some records claim it was executed immediately, its cries silenced in the cradle. Others suggest it was hidden, raised as an experiment, a living relic of sin. The truth is sealed, but the rumors became darker than any fact. A child of hell wandering somewhere in the shadows of Europe. Each tribunal grew more grotesque. Priests thundered about the wages of sin, warning that even a consecrated virgin could fall if vigilance waned. Her tears became ritual. Her silence became confession. Her suffering became evidence. In their eyes, she was no longer a woman but a mirror, reflecting the fears of a continent already haunted by plague, famine, and superstition. The danger was not just for her. Other nuns began to report strange dreams, shadows in their cells, unexplained touches in the night, some out of fear, some out of guilt, some perhaps out of desperation to avoid suspicion themselves. The devil's presence became a contagion, spreading through whispers until the convent itself felt cursed. The Inquisition used this hysteria to justify more trials, more confessions, more fire. What had begun with one nun's cry now consumed an entire community, and the church, ever eager to solidify its dominion, began to amplify the tale beyond borders. Traveling preachers carried her story from one village to another. Painters created lurid depictions of the hooved infant, etched into woodcuts that spread like wildfire among the illiterate masses. Pilgrims flocked not to holy relics, but to sites whispered to hold the blood or cloth of the devil's child. Markets sold tokens said to ward off the same fate, charms blessed by priests who knew fear was more profitable than faith. The ripple effect grew violent. In distant convents, other women found themselves accused by association. A nun with a swollen stomach, whether from illness or shame, was questioned not with pity, but with suspicion. Is yours too a child of Satan? Women who claimed visions or nightmares were dragged before the same tribunals. Their cries for help twisted into confessions of sin. Entire convents became cages of paranoia, each sister watching the other for signs of darkness. The devil did not need to enter through doors. Fear did his work for him. The nun's interrogations became cruel theater. Priests pressed her with questions crafted to entrap. When he came to you, did you resist with prayer? She answered yes, but they claimed her prayers were weak. Did you feel pleasure when he lay upon you? She answered no, and they called her liar. If she said yes, she would be damned for lust. If she said no, she would be damned for lying. It was not truth they sought, but spectacle. They wanted a monster, and they would carve one out of her with words and fire alike. And all the while the people watched. Ordinary men and women crowded outside the tribunal halls, waiting for scraps of rumor. Some swore they heard the infant's cries still echoing in the night, though the child was long hidden. Others claimed the nun's very shadow on the wall looked twisted, proof she carried hell inside her still. The hysteria fed itself, a serpent eating its own tail. The tribunal never asked the question that lingered in silence. What if she was telling the truth? Not metaphor, not madness, not deformity. What if hell had indeed walked among them, chosen her, and marked the earth with a child that bore its shape? That question, left unanswered, festered in every trembling prayer, every sleepless night. It was the silence louder than fire, and the doubt sharper than chains. For doubt was the one enemy the church could never wholly burn away. The story did not die with the tribunal. Instead, it spread like a disease, mutating with each retelling. In villages, taverns, and marketplaces, the nun's tragedy was whispered into legend. Some said she had been seduced willingly, others that she had been taken against her will. Still others that the devil had simply chosen her womb as his doorway into the world. Each version twisted her further away from humanity and closer to a symbol, a cautionary tale carved into Europe's memory. The church used her relentlessly. Her name was struck out, erased, but her story became sermon. Priests thundered of vigilance. Bishops warned that Satan prowled not only the forests or the night sky, but the very chambers of God's brides. Artists painted her likeness cloaked in shadow, with the hooved infant crawling across stone. In some depictions, flames rose around her, her face carved with horror. In others, she was shown kneeling before Christ, as if begging for forgiveness for the sin she never chose. But the true terror lay in how the story changed lives. Women entering convents now lived in fear that any misstep, any illness, any swelling of the body would mark them as the devil's next vessel. Ordinary mothers whispered that their children's deformities might be curses, not chance. Villages turned suspicious eyes on widows, midwives, and young girls, convinced the devil sought them most. An entire continent's paranoia deepened, and the nun's story was the spark. Some chronicles claim the child survived. They say the Inquisition did not destroy it, but hid it away in stone chambers beneath monasteries, to be studied, to be feared, to be paraded before high-ranking clergy as living evidence of hell's victory. Tales spread of a child growing older with hooves that left scorched marks on the ground, with eyes too black to hold light. Some claimed his cry never changed, that he always wailed like a newborn, even as his body grew. Others whispered he was carried from one hidden place to another, a secret relic of terror that no one dared expose. Yet the most chilling detail is how the hooved child became an idea more than a body. Parents used the tale to frighten disobedient children. Priests used it to silence doubters. The fear of corruption entered the bloodstream of Europe itself, reshaping how people understood sin, purity, and power. If Satan could touch a nun, if hell could win inside holy walls, then no one, peasant or noble, was safe. That fear was the Inquisition's most powerful ally. Behind this machinery of terror, however, the woman herself disappeared. Records of her vanish after a handful of hearings. Some say she died in prison, consumed by grief. Others that she was burned, though quietly, without the spectacle usually given to witches. There are whispers she was forced into silence, her body hidden in a nameless grave, her memory erased by the very church that made her infamous. It is this silence, this deliberate burial of truth, that makes her story even more haunting. The church preserved her suffering, but destroyed her identity, leaving only the echo of her pain to survive. And the echo of hooves did not stop there. Across Europe, new stories of demon children surfaced, each borrowing details from hers. A child born with a tail in Germany, a girl with goat eyes in Spain, a boy whose cries were said to mimic animal growls in Italy. None carried the weight of the nun's story, but together they wove a tapestry of fear that strengthened the Inquisition's hand. Every new abnormality was rebranded as proof. Every strange birth, every nightmare, every shadow in a convent hall pointed back to her. Witch trials soon found fuel in her legend. Women accused of witchcraft were pressed with questions eerily similar to hers. Had the devil lain with them? Had they borne his child? Had their wombs been vessels of darkness? The shadow of her case bled into the rhetoric of trials across Europe. A midwife who lost children in birth could be condemned as a servant of Satan. A woman with scars on her belly could be accused of carrying his offspring. Her story had transformed from scandal to precedent, a legal memory etched into fire and confession. And in the corridors of the church itself, debates raged in secret. Some theologians argued the story should be buried, erased, forgotten, lest it suggest Satan had real victory. Others insisted it should be repeated endlessly, hammered into every sermon, every court, every confession. It was too effective a weapon to discard. The nun's suffering had become a political tool, wielded not only against her, but against anyone the church wished to control. Fear was no longer an accident, it was policy. In convents, new rules emerged. Women were monitored more strictly. Confessors probed with questions about dreams, thoughts, even the subtlest temptations. Whispers of desire were treated as invitations to Satan. Punishments multiplied, not only for sin, but for suspicion. The walls of convents did not feel holy anymore. They felt like prisons. And behind every locked door, every whispered confession, the echo of hooves resounded, a reminder, a warning. Regional variations of the tale spread. In France, they said the nun's child had been taken to a forest and raised by witches, his hooves trampling circles into the earth, where no grass ever grew again. In Poland, peasants told of a monastery cellar where his cry was heard for generations, rattling chains beneath the stones. In England, traveling bards sang of Satan's monk, a creature who walked on cloven feet and brought plague to every town he entered. Each culture reshaped the horror to fit its own fears, but the core was always the same: a nun, a devil, and a child whose feet marked the triumph of hell. The echo of hooves became ritual. Families marked newborns with holy water at home, fearing baptism alone was too late. Farmers drew crosses on their stables, praying their livestock would not be born twisted. Some even whispered that storms carried the devil's child across the skies, his hooves clattering in thunder. The story had outgrown its origin. It had become folklore, faith, and fear woven into one. Centuries later, the legend still lingers. Historians find fragments, half-burned records, testimonies edited into silence, woodcuts passed from hand to trembling hand. In some cases, entire passages are blackened with ink, censored even by those who copied them. But what endures more than paper is the echo of hooves against stone, the echo of fear in the hearts of those who believed purity itself could be violated, the echo of a woman erased yet never forgotten. Because in the end, the child became more powerful than the tribunal, the Inquisition, or the church itself. The child became story, and story outlives fire. The devil may or may not have walked through convent walls, but once the tale was told, he did not need to. He lived in every fear, every sermon, every night of doubt. And perhaps that was his greatest triumph. Not the child itself, but the echo it left behind. For what is more terrifying than an enemy you cannot see, but only hear in the distance? What is more damning than a child whose very feet mark the triumph of hell? And what is more powerful than a story that can still make us shudder, long after the fire has burned to ash? When the tribunal faded and the years pressed forward, the story did not vanish. It calcified. The nun herself disappeared into the silence of forgotten records. Her name erased, her fate obscured. Some claimed she died in chains, broken by interrogation. Others whispered she was burned quietly, denied even the spectacle of fire that so many others were given. In the eyes of history, she became a shadow, present only in the echoes of what was said about her, never in her own words again. But silence is not safety. The church carried her story forward as a weapon. Her trial became precedent. Her cries became warning. Whenever suspicion rose in a convent, whenever a child was born twisted, whenever whispers of temptation arose, her tale was invoked. "Remember the nun who bore the devil's child?" priests would say. "Remember what happens when vigilance fails." And in those words, her suffering was reborn again and again. The aftermath spread like a stain. Midwives found themselves accused, their knowledge of birth rebranded as sorcery. Widows were watched, their solitude seen as dangerous, a sign that the devil might seek them out. Even children were not free. A crooked limb, a strange birthmark, an unusual cry. Any of these could mark a family as cursed. Fear became inheritance, passed from parent to child like blood. The nun's tragedy had become a template for paranoia, and yet the contradictions could not be ignored. The baby, said to be hell's proof, was never seen again. The Inquisition's records contradicted themselves, some claiming the child was executed at birth, others that it was hidden, others that it lived for years in secret chambers. This silence was its own weapon. By refusing to clarify, the church ensured the fear never ended. For a mystery unsettled is far more powerful than a fact. Every missing detail became an invitation for terror to grow. The aftermath was not just about fear, but control. By holding her story in their hands, the church gained leverage over every nun, every priest, every believer. Her life became a leash, her child became a chain, and with every generation that passed, the legend deepened until it was no longer her story at all. It was the world's. A story no one dared doubt, no one dared question, no one dared forget. And so the aftermath grew sharper with time. In the witch trials of later centuries, echoes of her accusations rang out. Women accused of consorting with demons were asked the same questions she had faced. Did the devil visit your bed? Did he plant his seed in your womb? Did you bear his child? Every answer damned them just as it had damned her. Her story had become a blueprint for persecution, and though her name was erased, her suffering was endlessly recycled. In villages, families lived in terror of resemblance. A child born too pale, too frail, or with limbs twisted by chance could drag suspicion upon an entire household. Mothers smothered infants in secret, believing death was kinder than the pyre. Fathers buried children in silence, praying the ground would hide what heaven would not forgive. The nun's story gave those fears form, making them impossible to escape. It was no longer a story, it was law. For silence in the hands of power is never absence. It is design. It is weapon. It is the reshaping of memory until truth itself is buried alongside the woman who once cried out that the devil had chosen her womb. And in that silence, the echo of her footsteps and of her child's hooves walked across the centuries unchecked, haunting all who heard them in whispered sermons and fearful nights. What made the tale unstoppable was not only what the Inquisition declared, but what the people themselves chose to believe. Fear needs little prompting, and once the story had entered the bloodstream of Europe, it lived in the imagination more powerfully than in any tribunal record. The nun's suffering was transmuted into folklore, into firelit warnings told at night, into murmurs in market stalls, into the hushed lessons passed from mothers to daughters. Belief reshaped reality. In towns where her story spread, suspicion took root in every household. A sudden illness might be explained as the devil's revenge. A woman's loneliness became evidence of temptation. A child born malformed was no longer seen as tragic fate, but as a cosmic message. And each time her legend was recalled, the nun who bore hell's child. The memory of her hooved infant turned suspicion into certainty and certainty into condemnation. The Inquisition harnessed this belief with ruthless precision. They needed only to whisper her tale, and the people did the rest. A crowd's fear could ignite faster than any torch, and once suspicion took hold, no proof was required. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families concealed their own kin. Midwives burned. Mothers wept. Children vanished into shallow graves. All of it tethered back to her story, a single event magnified into a continent-wide plague of paranoia. The weight of belief was heavier than chains. The nun herself had lived it. Every word she spoke reshaped into proof of her guilt. Now, long after her death, others bore the same weight. Women dragged to confessionals, priests questioned for doubt, even villages punished for whispers of heresy, all because of the shadows she left behind. Her suffering was no longer her own. It had been multiplied, recycled, reborn in countless bodies and countless tears. But the story did more than spread fear. It rewrote trust itself. Husbands doubted wives. Wives feared husbands. Children looked upon their parents with suspicion. Love itself could be poisoned by the weight of belief. And once belief curdled into paranoia, even the most innocent glance could be read as a sign of damnation. Society became its own inquisition, carrying out judgments without fire or chains, but with cold suspicion that isolated and destroyed. The church, for its part, found this atmosphere convenient. Kings leaned upon bishops, bishops leaned upon priests, and priests leaned upon rumor, each reinforcing the authority of the other. The Devil's Child was not only a story of sin, it was proof that obedience was survival. To doubt the church was to risk sharing the nun's fate. To question its narrative was to invite damnation. In this way, belief became architecture. It built walls stronger than stone, cages larger than prisons, and fires that never burned out. Belief does not need truth to thrive. It needs only fear. And fear, once planted, grows roots deeper than faith itself. That was the true triumph of her story, that even centuries later, the world could not forget the echo of hooves, the cry of a newborn damned, the silence of a woman erased. The devil may have never touched her womb, or perhaps he did, but belief in that possibility proved more enduring than any fact, more destructive than any fire, and more lasting than any truth could ever hope to be. In the end, the story of the nun who bore the Devil's Child is not only about one woman, one tribunal, or one infant said to be born with hooves. It is about the machinery of fear, the hunger of power, and the silence that erases truth until only legend remains. Her name is gone, her voice buried, but her shadow lingers, not because the devil proved his strength, but because the church proved the power of belief over reality. Think of it, a single claim, a single birth, and a single detail, the shape of a child's feet, was enough to bend generations into terror. No miracle of God spread so quickly, no holy relic traveled so far as the whispered image of hooves striking stone. People remembered it not as history, but but as inevitability. And in remembering, they gave it life. The devil himself needed no proof. Humanity's fear was proof enough. Centuries later, the echo still stirs unease. The story reappears in fragments, retold in folk tales, woven into sermons, dramatized in plays, whispered in the superstitions of rural villages. It persists because it feeds something deeper than doctrine, the suspicion that purity can be violated, that innocence can be corrupted, that evil is closer than the walls of any convent. The nun's child may never have walked beyond those stone chambers, but his hooves walk still, in imagination, in nightmares, in the quiet moments when faith trembles. And so we circle back to the beginning. A young woman trembling in confession, claiming she did not choose, claiming the devil chose her. Her words became chains, her cries became sermons, her silence became law. She was reduced to an emblem, a ghost wielded by power long after her body was ash, and her child, whether real or invention, became a prophecy. A prophecy that purity is fragile, that fear is stronger than faith, that the devil wins not with horns or fire, but with whispers that take root in the mind and never let go. The final twist is this: the devil did not need to win. The church, in spreading her story, gave him the victory. For whether her child lived or died, whether he bore hooves or only the curse of rumor, the legend carved itself into history as if it were fact. And every time it is retold, even now, it proves that hell does not need proof. It needs only memory, because that is the true weight of the tale. The echo of hooves never fades. It only shifts form. Sometimes it is the sound of suspicion in a crowded marketplace. Sometimes it is the silence of a child hidden away for fear of judgment. Sometimes it is the law itself, written in fire and fear rather than ink. And sometimes it is nothing more than the unease you feel when a story like this refuses to leave your thoughts. So when you hear the echo of hooves, ask yourself, are they the devil's footsteps or our own? Are we haunted by hell or by the stories we choose to believe? And if fear can outlive truth for centuries, then perhaps the devil's greatest triumph is not a child in a convent at all, but the way we keep carrying him with us, in every doubt, in every silence, in every whispered prayer that wonders whether faith is ever enough.